My dog was staring at the fence at 3:15 a.m. I thought it was nothing, until I checked the camera. Look at the right side. It moves when you don't notice.
This is a true horror story about something my dog saw at 3:15 a.m. Most people who spend their late, quiet nights casually browsing the internet are actively searching for a fictional scary story to give themselves a brief, highly entertaining, and completely safe thrill before turning off their bedside lamps and comfortably drifting off to a peaceful sleep, fully secure in the undeniable, comforting belief that their heavy brass locks and drawn window curtains provide an absolute, impenetrable physical barrier against the unpredictable, dark chaos of the outside world. But when the supposedly impenetrable, secure walls of your private, quiet sanctuary are inexplicably and silently breached, and the very environment you rely entirely on for absolute safety suddenly turns against you, it immediately becomes a terrifying real experience that permanently and violently shatters your core, foundational understanding of the natural, logical world. My name is Arthur, and I live entirely, peacefully alone with my incredibly loyal companion, a massive, highly intelligent, 90-pound, 5-year-old German Shepherd named Duke. We reside together in a sprawling, slightly outdated, heavily insulated single-story craftsman house located at the very absolute end of a deeply isolated, heavily wooded suburban cul-de-sac situated deep in the rural, freezing outskirts of the Pacific Northwest. I specifically and deliberately chose this remote, quiet property for its profound, undisturbed peace, entirely seeking a comfortable, secure haven heavily insulated against the chaotic, noisy, and deeply exhausting demands of the modern outside world. Our quiet, isolated neighborhood is completely and densely surrounded by thick, towering acres of ancient pine trees, creating a massive, natural, impenetrable barrier that effectively swallows any ambient noise from the distant, winding highway and plunges our narrow, dead-end street into a heavy, suffocating, pitch-black darkness the exact moment the sun finally sets behind the distant, jagged mountain range. The sprawling backyard of my property is incredibly expansive, covering nearly a full acre of flat, meticulously maintained grass. Entirely enclosed by a highly secure, 6-foot-tall privacy fence constructed from thick, aged cedar planks that fit tightly together without a single, microscopic gap. Beyond that high wooden fence lies an impenetrable wall of dark, tangled woods, a dense, wild, ancient forest that stretches endlessly for completely uninhabited, freezing miles. Normally, this isolated environment feels incredibly safe and profoundly peaceful, and Duke is the absolutely perfect, calm sentinel for such a secluded, solitary lifestyle. He is a highly trained, incredibly disciplined, and deeply intelligent dog who rarely ever barks without a highly specific, tangible, physical reason. He absolutely does not lose his mind over a stray squirrel running rapidly across the lawn. He completely ignores the distant, echoing howling of coyotes deep in the dark woods, and he never barks at the freezing winter wind violently rattling the bare, skeletal branches of the massive oak trees. At night, his normal, routine behavior is completely calm, utterly predictable, and deeply comforting. He simply completes a thorough, quiet patrol of the dark, empty living room, takes a long, loud drink from his metal water bowl in the kitchen, and heavily collapses onto his thick, orthopedic memory-foam bed located deep in the corner of my master bedroom, sleeping entirely like a dead, unmoving weight until the warm morning sun finally streams brightly through the horizontal plastic blinds. He is my perfect early warning system, my fiercely loyal protector, and the primary, undeniable reason I have never felt even a single ounce of primal fear living entirely alone in the deep, isolated woods. But the deeply unsettling, highly terrifying events that slowly unfolded on a bitterly cold, completely windless Tuesday night in late November proved completely that even the best, most highly trained animal instincts are utterly, completely useless against the ancient, unblinking anomalies that actively and silently hunt in the dead, pitch-black spaces of the waking world. The ambient temperature outside had aggressively and rapidly plummeted significantly below freezing just after dusk, leaving a thick, glittering layer of heavy white frost completely coating the dying grass of the expansive lawn and slowly creeping up the extreme exterior edges of the large, floor-to-ceiling sliding glass doors located at the very back of the dark living room. I had securely locked all the heavy brass deadbolts on the exterior wooden doors, completely engaged the modern glowing digital security system in the front foyer, and comfortably retired to my warm, insulated bed around 11 o'clock, completely exhausted and physically drained from a long, tedious day of monotonous work. Duke had flawlessly executed his normal, quiet nightly routine without a single hesitation, circling exactly 3 times on his soft bed before letting out a long, heavy, contented sigh and falling immediately into a deep, peaceful sleep in the dark corner. The entire sprawling property quickly and seamlessly settled into its usual, comforting, ambient background noises, the heavy wooden floorboards naturally creaking as the indoor temperature slowly dropped and the distant, muffled, mechanical hum of the basement furnace heavily pushing warm air through the metal floor vents. I fell instantly into a profound, heavy, dreamless sleep, entirely and foolishly convinced that my isolated home was completely empty, perfectly secure, and absolutely devoid of any immediate, unseen danger. But my deep, comfortable slumber was abruptly, violently, and jarringly shattered by a sound that completely bypassed my logical brain and directly struck my ancient, primal survival instincts. I did not wake up slowly, groggily, or naturally. My conscious mind violently snapped to absolute, terrifying attention exactly as if a giant, invisible, heavy switch had been forcefully thrown in the pitch-black darkness of my isolated bedroom. I lay perfectly, rigidly still on my back, my heavy head resting securely against my soft pillows, my rapidly beating heart hammering aggressively against my tight ribs exactly like a trapped, panicked bird desperately trying to escape a cage. I instinctively and immediately glanced over at the harsh, piercing red light of the digital alarm clock resting securely on my wooden nightstand, the glowing, unblinking numbers silently displaying exactly 3:15 a.m. The ambient temperature inside my previously warm, heavily insulated bedroom had suddenly and inexplicably plummeted to a highly dangerous degree, making the stagnant, dark air feel bitterly, bitingly cold, exactly as if a heavy, freezing, localized weight had been forcefully dropped directly onto my tense, trembling shoulders. I immediately noticed that the familiar, deeply comforting sound of Duke's heavy, rhythmic, sleeping breathing was completely absent from the dark corner of the room. I slowly sat up, my bare feet sinking painfully into the freezing, polished hardwood floorboards, and listened intensely to the heavily pressurized, dead silence of the isolated, sleeping house. From the pitch-black darkness of the open-plan living room situated entirely down the long, narrow central hallway, I clearly, undeniably heard a low, continuous, highly aggressive, guttural growl. It was a terrifying, deeply primal sound that I had absolutely never heard my dog make before in the entire 5 years I had owned him, a deep, vibrating, highly hostile, rumbling frequency that physically rattled his heavy chest and echoed ominously through the stagnant, freezing indoor air. I quickly walked out of my bedroom, entirely ignoring the deep, ancient, screaming primal survival instinct that violently ordered me to lock my heavy wooden door and hide completely under the heavy quilts, entirely driven by an overwhelming, desperate need to protect my loyal companion from whatever had breached our home. I moved silently and carefully down the long, dark corridor, my dry, burning eyes desperately trying to adjust to the pitch-black shadows pooling densely in the corners of the isolated house. The living room was completely unlit, completely devoid of any artificial illumination, lit only by the incredibly faint, sickly, pale moonlight that managed to weakly filter through the heavy, frosted glass of the large sliding back doors. Standing perfectly, rigidly still in the absolute dead center of the glass pane, his muscular front paws planted firmly and aggressively on the polished floorboards, was Duke. The thick, coarse fur along his entire spine was standing straight up exactly like stiff, unyielding wire. His ears were pinned completely flat against his heavy skull, and his sharp, white teeth were fully, violently bared in the freezing dark. He was staring directly, intensely, and entirely unblinking through the freezing glass, his absolute visual focus locked completely onto the far left corner of the massive, 6-foot wooden cedar privacy fence located at the absolute edge of the deep, sprawling backyard. And then, without absolutely any further warning or physical provocation, the low, vibrating growl violently escalated into a terrifying, mind-numbing explosion of aggressive noise. He started barking aggressively. It was absolutely not a normal, casual warning bark meant to chase away a wandering raccoon or a stray neighborhood cat. It was a frantic, violent, completely unhinged, deafening roar of pure, unadulterated, animalistic fury heavily mixed with a deep, primal terror. The massive, echoing volume of the aggressive barking completely shattered the heavily pressurized, dead silence of the sleeping house, violently bouncing off the pale drywall and pressing painfully against my sensitive inner eardrums. I practically sprinted across the dark, freezing living room, dropping heavily to my bare knees directly beside him and frantically grabbing his thick leather collar, desperately trying to physically restrain his massive, 90-pound muscular frame and forcefully pull him backward away from the cold glass. He violently and aggressively fought against my tight, desperate grip, his sharp claws clicking and slipping frantically against the smooth hardwood floorboards, his heavy, terrified body trembling aggressively with toxic, blinding adrenaline. I desperately shushed him, completely terrified that the massive, echoing noise would instantly wake the distant neighbors across the dark woods, but he completely ignored my frantic, whispered commands, his wide, burning eyes remaining permanently, fearfully locked onto the dark, distant fence line. I forcefully pulled him back just enough to carefully press my own pale, sweating face directly against the freezing, frosted glass of the sliding door, my rapid, terrified breath forming thick, highly visible white clouds of condensation that instantly froze against the cold pane. I squinted intensely into the pitch-black, sprawling expanse of the moonlit backyard, fully expecting to clearly see a massive black bear violently tearing through my plastic garbage cans or a desperate, wandering trespasser attempting to violently scale the tall wooden cedar planks. But the freezing, moonlit backyard was completely, entirely, flawlessly empty. The thick, glittering layer of heavy white frost completely covering the dying grass was perfectly, beautifully undisturbed, entirely lacking any heavy, dragging footprints or chaotic signs of a physical struggle. The dense, towering line of ancient pine trees located directly behind the 6-foot cedar fence was completely motionless, their bare, skeletal branches permanently suspended in the cold, dead air exactly like a highly detailed, macabre painting hanging in a silent museum. There was absolutely no rushing winter wind, no falling autumn leaves, no stray wild animals, and absolutely no movement outside whatsoever. But as Duke abruptly paused his deafening, aggressive barking for just a fraction of a single, agonizing second to frantically gasp for precious oxygen, the heavy, ambient atmosphere of the entire environment fundamentally, violently shifted. The silence that immediately followed his loud, echoing outburst was absolutely not a natural, comforting quiet. The silence feels incredibly heavy, a dense, oppressive, highly unnatural, static void that aggressively squeezed the precious oxygen right out of my tight, cramping lungs and made my inner ears physically ache with a sharp, sickening, piercing barometric pain. It felt exactly as if the entire sprawling property had suddenly and violently been plunged deep underwater, completely isolated and entirely cut off from the rest of the natural, breathing, living world. Duke absolutely wouldn't stop. After that single, agonizing second of suffocating, heavy silence, he violently lunged forward against my tight, slipping grip once again, his heavy front paws loudly striking the freezing glass as he aggressively resumed his frantic, deafening, terrified barking. But that wasn't the worst part. The absolutely most terrifying, mind-breaking, impossible detail of the entire ordeal aggressively revealed itself to my rapidly fracturing sanity as I desperately tried to physically drag his heavy, struggling body backward into the center of the dark living room. Something felt wrong, deeply, fundamentally, and impossibly wrong about the exact, highly specific way my highly trained dog was actively reacting to the seemingly empty, freezing backyard. I suddenly, sickeningly realized that he wasn't just blindly, mindlessly barking at the general direction of the wooden cedar fence or the deep, dark woods beyond it. He was actively, meticulously, and precisely tracking something completely invisible to my weak, biological human eyes. That's when I noticed it. His wide, terrified, completely unblinking eyes were firmly, perfectly locked onto the absolute far left corner of the top edge of the 6-foot cedar fence. Slowly, deliberately, and with a horrifying, physics-defying, smooth mechanical precision, Duke's massive head began to continuously pan toward the right. He was actively, aggressively following a highly specific, continuous movement creeping slowly and methodically along the entire length of the dark perimeter fence. I completely stopped breathing, a massive, freezing shockwave of pure, unadulterated primal dread violently tearing straight down my spine as I desperately followed his unbroken, terrified gaze entirely across the empty, moonlit yard. His eyes follow movement along fence with an absolute, terrifying, mathematical exactness, his loud, aggressive, frantic barks timing perfectly and flawlessly with the slow, creeping progression of whatever massive, unseen entity was actively gliding across the physical boundary of my secure property. But there was absolutely, undeniably nothing there. The pale, sickly moonlight clearly and flawlessly illuminated the flat, bare top of the aged cedar planks, proving beyond a single shadow of a doubt that there was absolutely no stray neighborhood cat silently walking the tightrope, no large, heavy raccoon desperately clinging to the wood, and no massive owl silently swooping low over the dying grass. But the absolute, horrifying realization that violently anchored my freezing, trembling knees to the hardwood floorboards was the specific, impossible angle of his terrifying gaze. Duke wasn't looking directly at the top edge of the 6-foot wooden fence. He was looking slightly, deliberately above it. His wide, terrified eyes were actively tracking something incredibly, impossibly tall, an ancient, towering, unblinking entity that was silently, effortlessly walking through the dense pine woods on the exact opposite side of the heavy cedar planks, casually looking completely over the 6-foot physical barrier and staring directly down into my quiet, isolated backyard. The unseen movement was incredibly slow, profoundly unnatural, and completely devoid of any earthly, biological logic, possessing a terrifying, absolute, heavy patience that actively attacked my remaining, fragile sanity. My rational, human brain desperately, pathetically, and forcefully began to actively explain the impossible anomaly away using cold, hard, desperate logic, an incredibly powerful biological defense mechanism specifically designed to completely prevent a total mental collapse. I forcefully told myself, with a violently shaking, deeply panicked internal voice, that my dog was simply reacting to a bizarre, elongated shadow cast by the pale moon moving slowly and naturally behind a dense winter cloud, creating a strange, terrifying optical illusion that perfectly mimicked a walking, towering figure. I quickly and desperately rationalized that his highly sensitive, superior canine nose had simply caught the incredibly faint, distant scent of a large, wandering animal deep in the dark, freezing woods, and he was completely, naturally confused by the absolute lack of visual confirmation. I desperately wanted to believe that this was absolutely nothing more than a harmless, easily explainable misunderstanding, a simple trick of the deep, heavily pressurized night completely devoid of any dark, supernatural malice or immediate physical danger to my quiet, isolated life. I absolutely refused to accept that. A true horror story was actively, violently unfolding right outside my fragile glass doors while I was entirely helpless to stop it. I finally, through sheer physical exhaustion, managed to forcefully drag Duke's heavy, trembling body entirely away from the freezing glass, aggressively pulling the thick, heavy blackout curtains completely shut to permanently block his terrifying view of the empty backyard. He continued to whine pathetically, pacing frantically and aggressively back and forth in front of the heavy fabric, his sharp claws clicking loudly and chaotically in the dark, but he eventually, slowly stopped his deafening barking, his heavy chest heaving violently as he collapsed completely exhausted onto the living room rug, his eyes remaining wide open and staring directly at the closed curtains. I sat perfectly, rigidly still on the very edge of the sectional couch for the absolute rest of the agonizing, endless, freezing night, my violently trembling hands firmly gripping his leather collar, entirely consumed by the raw, screaming, animalistic fear that completely saturated the stagnant indoor air. I did not move a single, aching muscle, entirely terrified to turn on a single artificial light or make a single, perceptible sound, desperately waiting for the heavy, suffocating barometric pressure to finally lift and the comforting, pale light of the morning sun to completely wash away the impossible, heavy darkness. When the dawn finally arrived, casting long, safe, warm shadows entirely across the living room, I desperately, frantically tried to completely laugh the entire terrifying ordeal off as a bizarre, isolated, completely meaningless event born of pure exhaustion. But the heavy, freezing knot of pure dread securely anchored in the very bottom of my empty stomach absolutely refused to untie itself. I needed absolute, undeniable, concrete digital proof to completely ground my rapidly fracturing mind and permanently prove to myself that my loyal dog was simply reacting to a harmless, unseen animal in the freezing dark. I remembered the motion-activated, high-definition infrared security camera I had meticulously mounted high up under the eaves of the back patio last summer, angled specifically and perfectly to capture the entire expanse of the backyard and the full, continuous length of the cedar privacy fence. I slowly walked into my home office, quickly opened my heavy laptop, my cold fingers slipping slightly on the keyboard, securely connected to the local digital storage drive, and rapidly located the specific video file digitally stamped at exactly 3:15 a.m. I took a deep, violently trembling breath, my dry eyes burning as I stared at the glowing monitor, and slowly clicked play. I wish I hadn't. I sat completely frozen in the suffocating, heavy darkness of my isolated home office, my violently trembling right hand tightly gripping the cold, smooth plastic of my computer mouse, entirely consumed by a creeping, deeply paralyzing dread that violently anchored my heavy body to the leather desk chair. The only source of illumination in the highly pressurized, bitterly cold room was the harsh, pale, sickly green glow of the digital video player heavily reflecting against my sweating, pale face, actively casting long, jumping, distorted shadows across the dark plaster walls behind me. After witnessing the absolute, mind-shattering impossibility of the dark entities inside my own living room, my rational, desperate, human brain violently demanded further investigation, forcefully trying to find a logical, earthly origin point for the massive, unblinking horrors that had silently invaded my secure sanctuary. I needed to know exactly how they had bypassed my heavy brass deadbolts and my glowing digital security system without triggering a single, mechanical alarm. I slowly, agonizingly navigated away from the internal camera archives and aggressively clicked on the external, motion-activated security feed specifically dedicated to monitoring our sprawling, pitch-black backyard. I deliberately dragged the digital playback cursor to the exact same night, meticulously aligning the digital timeline with the heavily corrupted indoor footage. The glowing digital timestamp located in the absolute bottom right corner of the high-definition media player silently and steadily ticked forward, displaying exactly 3:15 a.m. The initial, wide-angle infrared view of the exterior camera showed an incredibly mundane, quiet, completely undisturbed scene of suburban isolation that perfectly mirrored the deceptive safety of our indoor living room. The heavy, thick, high-definition lens perfectly captured the sprawling expanse of our dormant winter lawn, the frozen, dead grass appearing exactly like a massive, flat sea of heavily pixelated, bright white static under the invisible infrared floodlights. In the deep background, standing as a massive, imposing, physical barrier between my completely vulnerable family and the dense, ancient, pitch-black pine woods, was our tall, 6-foot wooden privacy fence. The thick wooden planks looked exactly like a solid, impenetrable, completely black wall actively holding back the suffocating void of the dark forest. I stared intensely at the glowing monitor, my dry, burning eyes meticulously scanning every single microscopic, grayscale pixel of the completely empty backyard. There was absolutely nothing obvious to indicate a physical intrusion. The large, heavy plastic children's swing set sat perfectly, terrifyingly still in the freezing, stagnant night air. The heavy metal patio furniture cast long, static, completely motionless shadows across the wooden decking. The tall, bare branches of the massive oak tree looming over the property did not sway, proving that the freezing winter night was entirely, completely windless. It looked perfectly peaceful, exactly like a generic, boring photograph of an empty yard, prompting my exhausted, sleep-deprived mind to briefly, pathetically hope that the indoor anomalies had simply been a bizarre, localized technological glitch. But that comforting, fragile illusion of absolute safety violently and permanently dissolved when a deep, primal, ancient survival instinct began to aggressively scream in the absolute darkest corners of my panic brain. Something felt fundamentally, horrifyingly wrong with the silent footage, an intense, overwhelming, and highly unnatural presence that actively bled directly out of the digital recording and violently saturated the stagnant, freezing air of my dark office. I noticed a subtle, microscopic, deeply unsettling micro-unease occurring in the extreme upper right corner of the video frame, completely detached from the main focal point of the empty lawn. There was a slight, highly unnatural digital distortion aggressively pulling at the grayscale pixels hovering just above the solid black line of the wooden fence. It looked exactly like a heavy, swirling, chaotic patch of visual static that completely defied the crisp, high-definition clarity of the rest of the recorded environment. In a completely windless, static environment, there was a sudden, smooth, fluid movement that absolutely didn't make any logical, earthly sense. I immediately paused the silent video, my heart completely stopping dead in my tight chest, skipping a violent, agonizing beat before hammering aggressively against my tight ribs exactly like a trapped, panicked bird. I took a deep, violently trembling breath, the freezing indoor air physically burning my tight, cramping lungs, and slowly, deliberately dragged the digital progress bar backward by exactly 10 seconds. I leaned extremely close to the glowing blue monitor, my unblinking eyes watering heavily from the abrasive, harsh glare, and whispered out loud to the heavily pressurized, empty silence of my office, "Look closely at the right side of the fence at 0:05. I pressed play, my entire body violently shaking as the silent, digital numbers of the timestamp silently ticked forward. 3 hours 15 minutes and 1 second. 3 hours 15 minutes and 2 seconds. 3 hours 15 minutes and 3 seconds. 3 hours 15 minutes and 4 seconds. And then, at exactly 3 hours 15 minutes and 5 seconds, the horrifying, impossible anomaly actively began its slow, terrifying reveal. Against the dense, heavy, solid black background of the tall wooden privacy fence, something incredibly pale slowly began to smoothly materialize out of the pitch-black shadows of the ancient pine woods. It did not simply step into the frame like a normal, physical human trespasser, it seemed to actively, organically grow out of the digital static itself, completely bypassing the immutable laws of solid matter. The pale mass almost perfectly blended into the heavy background noise of the cheap infrared sensor, acting exactly like a highly evolved, ancient chameleon meticulously adapted to perfectly mimic the heavily pixelated, chaotic distortion of a digital camera lens. At first, the physical shape was completely unclear, presenting only as a soft, smudged, highly distorted blurring of grayish-white pixels slowly rising upward against gravity. I desperately, pathetically tried to rationally explain it away, violently forcing my breaking mind to believe it was simply a large, stray nocturnal owl silently swooping down toward the frozen grass, or perhaps a heavy, localized puff of freezing winter fog rolling heavily over the wooden barrier. But as I agonizingly dragged the digital timeline forward frame by frame, the blurry, shifting mass violently solidified into a distinct, undeniable, physical form actively pulling its massive weight upward against the cold wood. The creeping, sickening realization instantly paralyzed my freezing lungs and sent a massive, freezing shockwave of pure, toxic adrenaline tearing straight down my spine. A figure is climbing over the fence. This was absolutely not a harmless, mundane technological glitch, and it certainly wasn't an innocent, wandering animal. This was a terrifying real experience actively unfolding on my computer screen, completely and permanently stripping away every single rational, logical defense mechanism I possessed. I watched in absolute, mind-numbing horror as the pale, highly unnatural entity finally crested the top of the heavy wooden fence, allowing the harsh, invisible infrared light of the security camera to fully catch and expose its impossible, nightmare-inducing anatomy. As the figure pulled itself completely over the solid black line of the wooden planks, the deeply disturbing details of its physical structure violently assaulted my rapidly fracturing sanity. It was entirely, impossibly too thin, possessing a highly unnatural, emaciated skeletal frame completely devoid of any healthy, biological human muscle mass or natural body fat. Its pale limbs were horrifyingly, unnaturally elongated, stretching far past the normal, biological proportions of a human arm or leg, looking exactly like taut, pale, highly pressurized wires heavily wrapped in smooth, unyielding, stretched porcelain skin. The joints of its long, spindly arms and legs seemed to bend and articulate at sharp, impossible, physics-defying angles, completely lacking the natural, structural limitations of human bone and cartilage. Its creeping, descending movements were deeply unnatural, a slow, flawless, highly mechanical, spider-like calculation that completely lacked the subtle, fluid grace, the heavy shifting of physical weight, or the rhythmic biological bobbing of a living, breathing human being. It moved exactly like a heavy, perfectly engineered, ancient marionette being slowly and deliberately lowered into my backyard by unseen, dark strings extending directly up into the pitch-black, starless sky. It absolutely did not look fully human, completely lacking a distinct, recognizable face, human clothing, or any earthly, biological features that my terrified mind could logically process. The psychological pressure of actively watching this towering, unnatural entity slowly, meticulously breach the physical, protective perimeter of my safe home was immense, an overwhelming, crushing, deeply physical weight that actively squeezed the precious oxygen right out of my chest. I desperately tried to focus my burning, dry eyes directly onto the center of its pale, shifting mass, needing to see exactly what kind of impossible nightmare was slowly creeping down the wooden planks toward my frozen lawn. But the entity exhibited a highly bizarre, terrifying, completely unnatural strange behavior that actively defied the mechanical optics of the high-definition camera. Whenever I forced my eyes to stare directly, exclusively at the exact center of the pale figure on the glowing screen, its physical form seemed to aggressively dissolve and violently fragment into chaotic, swirling digital noise, completely blurring out of existence and becoming perfectly invisible against the wooden fence. It was only clearly, undeniably visible when I purposefully shifted my visual focus away from it, staring intently at the empty swing set or the patio furniture on the opposite side of the screen, forcing myself to observe its horrifying descent exclusively through the blurry, highly sensitive edges of my peripheral vision. It was a dark, impossible optical illusion specifically designed to completely bypass direct, biological observation, a terrifying confirmation that this entity was fundamentally, inherently hostile to the natural laws of light and human perception. Furthermore, as I watched the silent, black and white recording, I realized that the pale, elongated figure did not climb downward smoothly or linearly. It seemed to aggressively, violently shift its physical position entirely between the individual recorded frames of the digital footage, completely bypassing the natural, linear progression of motion and gravity. In one microscopic, frozen frame, its long, pale fingers were tightly gripping the very top of the wooden planks. In the very next consecutive frame, its massive, spider-like body was already halfway down the fence, entirely omitting the physical, logical movement required to traverse that distance. It was glitching through physical space, heavily manipulating the digital recording exactly as it manipulated the heavy, static shadows of the real world. Living through a true horror story is not a brief, fleeting moment of simple, entertaining fear. It is a permanent, waking, suffocating nightmare that entirely overwrites your understanding of reality, violently forcing you to accept that you are completely helpless against the ancient things that hunt in the silent spaces. The heavy, pressurized silence of my dark home office violently pressed against my inner eardrums, but my frantic, terrified mind suddenly remembered a deeply disturbing, seemingly insignificant detail from that exact same freezing Thursday night. That's when I noticed it. I clearly remembered suddenly waking up in the absolute dead of the night to the loud, aggressive, frantic sound of my large golden retriever barking violently in the central hallway. I had sleepily assumed the dog had simply heard a random stray cat or a passing raccoon outside the front door, and I had simply rolled over and gone entirely back to sleep, completely oblivious to the massive, highly predatory void actively invading my property. Sitting completely frozen in my leather chair, I frantically unmuted the digital video player, allowing the highly compressed, heavily degraded audio track of the exterior security camera to softly hiss through the small computer speakers. I meticulously cross-referenced the exact time of my dog's violent, aggressive barking with the digital timestamp of the security footage displaying the pale entity on the fence. The final, terrifying escalation completely and permanently destroyed my remaining sanity. The timing of the dog's frantic barking matched with terrifying, absolute, mathematical precision. The heavy, muffled sound of the dog violently throwing its physical weight against the locked back door echoed through the digital recording exactly, perfectly in sync with the pale figure's impossible movements. Every single time the pale, unnatural entity twitched, aggressively glitched between frames, or rapidly shifted its horrifying, elongated position on the dark wooden fence, the dog's barking violently escalated into a desperate, screaming, primal panic. The dog hadn't been blindly barking at a passing nocturnal animal in the dark woods, it had been actively, desperately trying to warn my sleeping, entirely oblivious family that a massive, unblinking, ancient predator was slowly, meticulously climbing directly into our supposedly secure, locked sanctuary. The dog could physically sense the heavy, toxic, freezing drop in barometric pressure, the deeply unnatural, highly malevolent aura violently bleeding directly off the entity's pale, shifting surface, completely bypassing the digital camouflage that was actively tricking the camera lens. I watched the final seconds of the clipped video as the tall, pale, impossibly thin figure finally reached the frozen, dead grass of the backyard, its long, spider-like limbs silently absorbing its massive, unnatural weight without disturbing a single blade of frost-covered grass. It did not immediately sprint toward the large, floor-to-ceiling glass window of the living room. It did not exhibit the chaotic, aggressive, rushed behavior of a human burglar or a desperate, starving animal. Instead, it slowly, deliberately crouched down low against the heavy, dark shadows. Pooling densely at the base of the wooden fence, its pale, featureless mass seamlessly, perfectly blending back into the heavy digital static of the recording until it was entirely, completely invisible to the direct, unblinking gaze of the camera lens. It was displaying a highly calculated, infinitely patient, deeply predatory intelligence that completely chilled the blood rapidly freezing in my tired veins. It was actively waiting, meticulously planning its silent, effortless breach of our physical home, completely aware of the camera's visual blind spots and entirely manipulating its own physical form to avoid direct detection. I sat completely alone in the freezing, suffocating dark of my home office, the pale blue light of the paused, empty screen heavily washing over my terrified, completely paralyzed body, my mind entirely consumed by the heavy, impossible truth permanently burned into my exhausted retinas. The thing wasn't just climbing over the fence. It was trying not to be seen. I was entirely, helplessly trapped in a suffocating, endless cycle of my own making, completely unable to pull my violently trembling hand away from the cold plastic of the computer mouse as I sat frozen in the pitch-black darkness of my isolated home office. The heavy, oppressive atmosphere of the dark room pressed violently against my inner eardrums, making the frantic, uneven, terrified hammering of my own heartbeat sound exactly like a massive sledgehammer striking an empty metal drum. I kept obsessively, frantically dragging the small digital progress bar back to the exact same starting point on the digital video player, looping the completely silent, black and white infrared security footage over and over again. The glowing digital timestamp in the bottom right corner of the harsh, pale blue monitor silently ticked from 11:41 p.m. to 11:42 p.m., replaying the exact same mundane scene of my family sitting quietly on our large sectional couch in the living room 3 nights prior. My wife was resting her head perfectly still against my right shoulder, my young son was sitting cross-legged on the thick woven area rug, and the massive, floor-to-ceiling glass window directly behind the couch perfectly reflected the entire room exactly like a deep, dark mirror. I was desperately, pathetically searching for a rational, logical explanation that my exhausted, panicked mind could accept, completely terrified of the impossible, towering fourth figure with the pale, hollow porcelain mask standing silently in the dark reflection directly behind my oblivious wife. But something wasn't right. As I forced my dry, burning, unblinking eyes to meticulously review the exact same continuous 60-second segment of video for the 50th agonizing time, a completely new, deeply unsettling anomaly began to aggressively reveal itself to my rapidly fracturing sanity. The silent, highly compressed security footage was absolutely not behaving like a fixed, static recording of a past, unchangeable event. It was completely, terrifyingly fluid. Every single time I clicked the rewind button and allowed the short video loop to play from the beginning, the massive, dark entity in the reflection was not standing in its original, initial position. It was moving. It was an incredibly subtle, highly unnatural, deeply mechanical shifting that completely bypassed the normal, biological fluidity of human motion, but the horrifying progression was undeniably clear. On the first few replays, the pale mask was hovering near the top edge of the window frame, partially obscured by the heavy pixelation of the cheap night vision lens. But with each consecutive loop, the figure appeared significantly closer to the physical bodies of my family. It was slowly, deliberately leaning its massive, heavy, shadowy bulk forward, descending from the suffocating darkness of the deep background and creeping agonizingly closer to the exposed, resting back of my wife's neck. I watched in absolute, mind-numbing horror as the pale, rigid features of its featureless face grew slightly larger, slightly more defined, and infinitely more menacing in the dark glass with every single replay. The movement was becoming terrifyingly clearer, a smooth, flawless, gliding descent that completely ignored the immutable laws of digital data and linear time. Human psychological denial is an incredibly powerful, deeply desperate biological defense mechanism, especially when you are violently thrust into a terrifying situation that completely shatters your core understanding of reality. I immediately, forcefully tried to convince my breaking mind that I was simply experiencing a severe technical malfunction, aggressively explaining the impossible anomaly away using cold, hard, desperate logic. I told myself, with a violently shaking, deeply panicked internal voice, that it was simply a severe digital artifact, a common buffering glitch caused by the cheap, low-light infrared sensor of the camera aggressively struggling to accurately process the chaotic, flickering television light against the highly reflective glass surface. I rationalized that the local hard drive was failing, heavily corrupting the video cache and causing overlapping, ghost-like composite frames to actively bleed into one another, creating a bizarre optical illusion that my exhausted, sleep-deprived brain was misinterpreting as forward movement. I desperately wanted to believe that this was a mundane camera issue, entirely devoid of any dark, supernatural malice or immediate physical danger to my sleeping family. I took a deep, violently trembling breath, my tight, cramping lungs desperately gasping for the freezing, thin indoor air, entirely convinced that my rational explanation was correct. That's when I noticed it. I watched the silent, black and white video loop one final, agonizing time, my clammy fingers gripping the edge of my wooden desk so incredibly tightly that my knuckles turned completely, painfully white. The pale, hollow mask in the reflection was now hovering mere microscopic inches away from my wife's digital silhouette, entirely dominating the dark glass. But as I stared intensely at the glowing monitor, the terrifying, impossible reality violently collapsed right in front of my wide, disbelieving eyes. The massive figure in the footage abruptly, violently paused mid-climb. It did not freeze because the video player buffered, the glowing digital timestamp continued to silently tick forward, and the flickering light of the television continued to wash over the room, but the entity itself became completely, statuesquely still. And then, moving with a highly deliberate, flawlessly smooth, physics-defying rotation that completely lacked the subtle articulation of a biological neck, it slowly turned its heavy, porcelain head entirely away from the back of my wife's resting head. It rotated its featureless face exactly 90 degrees, angling its hollow, unblinking, bottomless dark voids perfectly and flawlessly straight into the hidden lens of the security camera mounted high in the corner of the room. The creeping, sickening realization instantly paralyzed my freezing lungs, sending a massive, freezing shockwave of pure, toxic adrenaline tearing straight down my spine. The deeply terrifying, impossible detail was not just that it was looking at the camera, it was the horrifying realization that it only seemed to move when my direct visual focus was entirely distracted. When I stared intensely at the pale mask, it remained completely, perfectly frozen in the digital reflection. But the exact moment my exhausted eyes naturally flickered down to check the glowing digital timestamp or shifted to look at the innocent face of my young son, my peripheral vision would violently catch the massive, dark shadow smoothly gliding forward. It was actively, profoundly aware of my observation. It was highly intelligent, completely understanding that I was currently sitting in the dark office days later, helplessly watching it through the digital archive. It was aggressively manipulating the recorded footage, actively toying with my rapidly breaking sanity, establishing direct, unbroken, impossible eye contact through the digital barrier. Listening to a fictional scary story online can give you a brief chill, but being the active target in a dark, unblinking confrontation that entirely defies all natural earthly logic is a deeply traumatizing real experience that permanently poisons your existence, stripping away every single logical defense mechanism you possess. I forcefully squeezed my burning, dry eyes tightly shut, completely terrified to move a single, violently aching muscle, desperately praying that the heavy, suffocating barometric pressure violently crushing my home office would simply lift. But I couldn't explain it. The heavy, intense, deeply malevolent presence saturating the stagnant air suddenly spiked to an unbearable, terrifying degree, violently transitioning from a digital nightmare into a physical, waking reality. The dead, heavily pressurized silence of the isolated house was abruptly and violently shattered by a sound coming from the long, dark, central hallway outside my closed office door. I heard the sharp, frantic, unmistakable clicking of heavy claws scrambling aggressively against the cold, polished hardwood floorboards. It was our family dog, a large, incredibly gentle, highly affectionate golden retriever who absolutely never made a single sound during the quiet hours of the night. He had been peacefully sleeping on his large, comfortable bed in the living room down the hall, but now he was wide awake, and he was absolutely terrified. A low, guttural, highly aggressive growl violently vibrated through the floorboards, a deeply primal, defensive sound I had never, ever heard our sweet animal make before. The deep growl slowly escalated into a series of sharp, frantic, booming barks that echoed deafeningly loud in the pitch-black house. My heart skipped a violent, agonizing beat before hammering aggressively against my tight ribs exactly like a trapped, panicked bird. The dog was reacting exactly to the same spot, exhibiting the exact same terrifying behavior in the exact same direction as the entity I was actively watching on the paused computer monitor. The nightmare had finally, silently crossed over, completely bypassing the digital boundaries of the recorded footage and violently entering the physical reality of my home. I knew, with absolute, mind-shattering certainty, that I could not just stay hidden in the dark office while my family slept completely unaware down the hall. I slowly, agonizingly pushed myself up from my heavy leather desk chair, my bare feet sinking painfully into the freezing floorboards, my entire body violently trembling as a raw, screaming, animalistic fear entirely consumed my fragile soul. I walked completely out of the home office and stepped into the pitch-black, freezing expanse of the central hallway, the ambient temperature dropping so significantly that my rapid, terrified breath began to form thick, highly visible white clouds of condensation in the stagnant air. I slowly crept down the long, dark corridor, my back pressed tightly against the cold plaster wall, desperately following the chaotic, aggressive sounds of the dog's frantic barking. When I finally reached the wide, open threshold of the living room, I completely stopped breathing. The room was bathed in the pale, cold, grey light of the moon filtering weakly through the trees outside. Our golden retriever was standing perfectly rigid in the absolute dead center of the thick woven area rug, his coarse, golden hackles raised entirely along his stiff spine, his sharp teeth bared aggressively as he barked violently at the massive, floor-to-ceiling glass window spanning the back wall. I slowly, carefully walked up to stand directly beside him, my clammy, sweating hands gently resting on his trembling back in a desperate attempt to calm him down, but his intense, burning focus remained completely, unbreakably locked onto the dark glass. I swallowed the hard, dry lump of pure terror wedged deeply in my freezing throat and forced my wide, terrified eyes to look directly into the pitch-black mirror of the massive window. I expected to see the horrifying, pale porcelain mask staring back at me from the cold reflection, but the final escalation of this impossible nightmare was infinitely more subtle and deeply terrifying. I looked through the thick, double-paned glass, my vision piercing the faint reflection of the room and settling on the dark, sprawling expanse of our isolated backyard. Everything looked completely, flawlessly normal. The heavy, wooden privacy fence bordering our property stood perfectly still in the freezing night air. The massive, ancient pine trees were entirely silent, their bare branches casting long, natural, completely mundane shadows across the frost-covered grass. There was absolutely no towering, pitch-black figure standing outside in the cold. There was no pale mask hovering near the tree line. The backyard was completely, entirely empty, devoid of any physical intruder or dark anomaly. But the heavy, toxic, deeply unnatural aura violently saturating the living room completely refused to fade, and the dog continued to bark aggressively at the glass, entirely convinced that a massive, highly predatory threat was standing right in front of us. My rational, desperate mind violently tried to convince me that the dog was simply barking at a stray raccoon walking along the top of the wooden fence, or perhaps a large, passing deer that had quickly vanished into the dense woods. I wanted so desperately to believe that the secure walls of my house were still impenetrable, that the terrifying entity from the security footage was just a digital hallucination entirely contained within the local hard drive of my computer. But a heavy, hypnotic, invasive compulsion aggressively commanded me to reach into the deep pocket of my sweatpants and pull out my mobile phone. My cold, violently shaking fingers fumbled with the smooth glass screen as I quickly unlocked the device and opened the dedicated application for our home security system. I desperately needed to check the live camera feed, to use the unblinking, objective, infrared lens of the camera mounted high in the corner of the ceiling to definitively prove to my rapidly fracturing sanity that the living room was completely empty and safe. The small application screen buffered for a fraction of a single, highly pressurized second, the loading circle spinning agonizingly slowly in the dark, before the live, high-definition, sickly green-tinted visual data violently snapped into sharp focus. The camera perfectly captured the wide, downward angle of the entire living room. It clearly showed the large sectional couch sitting empty in the center of the frame. It perfectly showed our golden retriever standing rigidly on the rug, aggressively barking toward the back of the house. It accurately showed the top of my own head, capturing my physical body standing perfectly still, holding the glowing phone, staring intensely out the massive glass window into the pitch-black backyard. But the terrifying, impossible twist violently slammed into my chest like a heavy sledgehammer, instantly and permanently destroying the final, fragile remnants of my rational mind in a single, devastating blow. The camera showed something else entirely, something that my own physical, biological eyes were entirely failing to perceive. The massive, floor-to-ceiling glass window did not just reflect the empty room in the infrared footage. Standing perfectly, terrifyingly still inside the actual, physical boundaries of the living room, positioned directly and intimately behind my own exposed, vulnerable back, was the exact same towering, pitch-black figure with the pale, hollow porcelain mask. It was not outside in the freezing yard. It was not trapped in a corrupted digital reflection on an archived video file. It had silently, effortlessly crossed over from the dark digital ether, completely bypassing the heavy brass deadbolts and the glowing security system, to physically manifest inside my locked home. The dog wasn't barking at the window because he saw something outside in the dark woods, he was aggressively barking at the window because he could clearly see the massive, dark, hovering reflection of the ancient entity standing right behind me in the room. The entity did not move. It did not breathe. It simply stood there in the freezing, stagnant air, its heavy, unnatural void actively absorbing the invisible infrared light of the camera, its hollow, unblinking features staring intensely at the back of my neck with a horrifying, ancient malice. I sat completely frozen, my entire body violently trembling as the raw, screaming, animalistic fear entirely consumed my soul, forcing me to accept that I was no longer the apex predator in my own secure environment, but merely trapped prey waiting entirely at the mercy of the dark things that hunt in the silent spaces. I did not turn around. I completely, absolutely refused to take my terrified eyes off the glowing screen of my phone, knowing with absolute, dark certainty that making direct, physical eye contact with the pale mask hovering behind me would instantly, permanently, and fatally seal my terrible fate. We still live in this sprawling, isolated craftsman house, completely trapped in a waking, suffocating paranoia that entirely poisons every single quiet moment of our existence. I meticulously ensure every single door is locked, I leave all the interior lights burning brightly throughout the night, and I absolutely refuse to ever sit on the large sectional couch after the sun goes down. My dog still barks at the fence every night. I stopped checking the camera. Because the last time I did, it wasn't outside anymore.